people come to that realization in real life, we need fantasy stories to show us how to deal with that. Because otherwise, there's no other instruction manuals. I think fantasy has a really special way, fiction in general has a really special way of being able to tell truths that are too heavy for just regular prose. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Fix Stories. This is the podcast where storytellers bring their stuck, tangled, or not quite their stories, and the editors from 1 Billion Arc help them figure out what's working, what's not, and how to tell the story in the best way possible. So the point of this is we're not here to rewrite your story, but we're here to make you think about how to tell it better. So my name is Jaylan. I am the editor-in-chief of 1 Billion Arc, and we also have Jared here.
Hello, I'm the founder of 1 Billion Arc and
today,
dev editor, I guess.
Yes, yeah. And today we are talking about Ellen Sanders' story, Realmcrosser. So Ellen, I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what got you into writing in the first place.
Sure. So my name is Ellen Sanders, and I am currently in the process of writing my first novel. I have always wanted to be a writer from the time that I was very, very small. When I was a little kid, I used to draw little comics on things. My drawing never improved, but my writing did, fortunately. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I had been diagnosed with ADHD in my 40s, and that was kind of an eye-opener for me for many reasons, but one of them was realizing that maybe this explained why I had yet to finish anything. I had a lot of projects that I had started that I had made significant headway on, but I had never finished anything. And I realized this is something I really want to do. So I'm going to buckle down and figure out a way that I can make this into an actual thing that I can accomplish. And one of the things I decided to do was that I wanted to self-publish, which just seemed to make it so much easier. Not that self-publishing is easy, it's hard, but it has its own difficulties. Just knowing that I could put it out there in the way that I felt the story needed to be told just made a huge difference for me. And then it was a question of learning those executive functioning skills and self-management skills to be able to do this. So I'm pretty far into it now. I'm about 75,000 words in. It's going to be a long one, so I still have a long way to go. But I feel confident now that yes, it will get done, and the skills that I've put in place are actually working. So that's really good.
That's awesome. That's so exciting. For all of us, all have dealt with, I mean, Jared, you can speak to this more. I haven't been diagnosed with ADHD, but I think in our last Indie Author Spotlight episode with you, Ellen, we were talking about how there's something undiagnosed going on up here.
Yeah, a lot of people have that, I think.
I was just going to say that I it's one of the reasons why I was so sad that I wasn't able to be at your Indie Author Spotlight, because me and Jaylan have had many conversations about my ADHD and how that impacts so much of both OVA and my creative stuff. And she is also my first ever editor, so she's been my editor for a few years now. And she has definitely been privy to my creative ADHD and how I jump to a million different projects, and has always been graceful about it, and has never been like, okay, come on, can we finish something? And I'm just like, no, we can't. I have fun making stuff. So I feel you, and I'm so glad to get to talk to you.
Yeah. I think there's something true about the way that the creative brain functions, no matter if it's neurotypical, or not. I personally don't think anyone is neurotypical, because I think that all of our brains are different. But in general, I think that creative ADHD is actually a superpower, because the way that it kind of works with your creative intuition to let you know exactly what needs priority when there's so much competing for priority in life. I feel like it just is a great way that the cream rises to the top, and the stories that are really important do get told. So with that being said, what was it about this story in particular that was the story that you knew you needed to tell, and it was worth committing so much of your time and energy and focus to finishing?
Maybe this answer isn't very deep, but I really wanted to write something fun. I wanted to write something fun, and it was a bit different than things that I had been writing. And I had never tried to write a fantasy novel before, even though I have always loved fantasy. And I just had this idea in my head about a woman living in a magical society who doesn't have any magic of her own, who is in a really disenfranchised position and suddenly finds herself in not quite an arranged marriage, finds herself unexpectedly married to a guy who's much more highly ranked than she is, and that they have competing goals, and what does that look like? So that was it was in my head for a long time. And when I realized I wanted to get serious about it, I thought maybe this is what I should pursue, even though I haven't done a fantasy novel before. So I just decided to go that route, and I've been very glad that I did. I've had more and more confirmation that this is the story I should be writing.
Definitely. I'll get into more of why I also agree that this is the story I should be writing. But before we jump into, as Jared would say, the meat and potatoes, we have to pull that phrasing back in now that you're actually here. But do you want to give your elevator pitch for, just summing up the story in a few sentences for the audience so that they can have an idea of what we're talking
absolutely.
about here?
So it's about a magicless serf named Aira, and she's forcibly married to a powerful mage lord after he saves her from a brutal punishment, only for her to discover that he is sworn to destroy the resistance movement that she has joined. So as their unlikely marriage deepens into unexpected love, she's caught between loyalty to her oppressed people and the man she didn't intend to care for. So she has to choose, does she betray him to free her people, or does she sacrifice that chance to protect their marriage and the bond that she never expected?
That's so exciting. Okay, so yeah, we'll just jump right in then. Let me share the document that we have first. All right, we got chapter 1 up here, and we did leave our comments on the document. Our third editor also left his comments here, and I will touch on some of them, but sadly he was not able to be at the recording, so I'll just have to pass along his notes. But yeah, other than that, Jared, I will let you kick us off. We'll start with going over what is working.
Okay, so for me, I first want to say that you are a great writer. I really enjoyed the writing. You will find, if you go back and listen to any of the previous Let's Fix stories that I have been on, there are some that I always talk about my interest in the story and how I am very easily bored and need to I need to be entertained in order to really enjoy it. And I found myself very much entertained. So that I want to start with. I also want to say that I liked the idea of a character that is disenfranchised and being a part of a culture as an African American, comes from a background of understanding how culture can be appropriated, how it can be misused, and you can be looked down while the same people that look down upon you are also using your culture to critique you in some way, shape, or form. And so the fact that you had a character that was in that realm really did, no pun intended, really did I really did like that. One of the things that I want to touch on specifically is page 4, where we are talking about where you talk about it must be, I whisper, taking the empty floor, sealing the shelves. This last line here, the now that chance is gone, my already small world constricted even more tightly around me. My comment there was perfect because earlier in there, I had made a comment about wanting to feel that loss in this moment a lot more. And if I had been more patient, I would have seen this part, but I was not. So I admit that. But I would say that even to improve upon that, I would say that give us a little bit more of this. Because in this moment, it is, as I just mentioned, about the whole idea of cultural appropriation, losing the things that make you, and then watching others take that from you and use it. And there's a level of pain that comes with that. And that resonated with me. And so I was like, what does that feel like? What is that? I want the reader to be able to understand what that feels like. What does it feel like for and I wasn't sure how to pronounce it. Was it Ira or Ira?
Aira.
Okay. So I wanted her to be able to, I wanted us to feel her pain in that moment. This isn't just a throwaway moment of the sad thing with those books being gone. The books being gone, that's a big moment for her. It's a symbolic form of like everything that makes us has been taken here, and that matters. And so I feel like I would love you to do more of that, of what you did in this one sentence here at the end. I think do more of that would be fantastic. I'll see what else. So most of my comments generally were not so much what wasn't working, but more about questions that I had and things that I wondered if I missed to go back and improve. improve upon. So that is where I will leave us for now. As far as I'm concerned, I feel like Jaylon and Charles had a lot more to say as far as like, and keep in mind, please note, this is not me saying that like, because I didn't have like a whole bunch of highlighted, this is what's working and this is what wasn't. Most of the time I didn't add anything further because there were points where they were pointing out really good stuff that was working. And I was like, well, I don't need to add on to it. You know, you don't need 3 comments saying the same thing. So, but no, please know that it's no reflection of you. It was just purely, I didn't have anything to add based on what they had said. So with that said, I can turn it back over to you, Jaylon, because you may have had very specific things you wanted to point out. And so did Charles.
I think I did write down 2 things in particular that were really exciting me about what we had so far. And I know that, you know, we're only looking at the first chapter. So the entire story structure, there's going to be so much more that is really, really working in that. But just taking this first chapter, it's kind of important because it's where people decide whether they keep reading or not. And like Jared said, like it held on to your attention because it was unique. It said something that you know, we haven't seen said before. It's fantasy and there's a million fantasy stories, but your voice and your creativity really came through specifically. Of course. So I will start with,
I will say this too, because I want to piggyback off of what Jaylon said as well. The fact that you were writing fantasy and romantasy is a genre that, for our listeners, you guys know, if you listen to older episodes, I'm always complaining about romantasy books and not wanting to, not wanting to, but just like they're not my favorite. But mostly because I think that most of the romantasy that we read, and fortunately for us, most of the romantasies we've had on our show have had something to say other than just, you know, he's hot, no, he's not, you know, and for that, and I'm so glad for that, and that's to say that, like, that's not to say that in the romantasy genre there aren't more of those that actually have something to say, but just here in our personal lived experience, we've encountered a lot of authors that have had something to say, and I think that that's awesome, and you are doing that as well, touching on, because I think that's the point of all fantasy really is, you know, no matter what, even if you have, you know, dragons or leprechauns or fae or whatever it may be, the deeper meaning is how do we break down real world problems into a world that's easier to digest. And fantasy just makes scary, big, abstract thoughts into more digestible things. So I love that you're doing that here, and bringing that here. And so, again, as I always say, a story that has nothing to say is no story, in my opinion. So I'm glad that you did that, and just wanted to piggyback off what Jaylon was saying there.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I wanted to, I mean, we don't see my male main character in this excerpt, but I really wanted to write a male main character who, because I know, and I mean, I know lots of people love this, but I'm not so interested in the morally gray romantic hero. I think some morally gray villains, which is fine, but I wanted to write a character who is grappling with his own identity issues and his own problems, and the two of them work those things out in tandem by working together and collaborating with each other. So that's what the romance is based on, and that's what I wanted to do, and have that also support the fantasy story as well.
Yeah, that definitely worked really well. You did well with that for sure. And yeah, my comment is kind of going to be piggybacking off of what Jared said as well, specifically with the cultural appropriation themes. It being embroidery, that is the symbol of their culture that is being stolen from them, and they're forbidden to appreciate it themselves. For Jared, from his experience as a Black person, that's very resonant, but me, it resonated as well being a female, because I've seen so many stories where the trope is that the oppressed females they can only sit in the house and embroider all day long. And like that is kind of thrown out as a trope of showing the oppressed female. So I really loved, like, you had so many layers in this story. And I specifically loved that embroidery is being reclaimed as now a positive thing. And you're showing that it's this beautiful sense of culture, identity, and beauty that these characters own, and it represents them. And, you know, they're in a place where these oppressed females are bravely fighting to take it back from the ruling class that stole it from them. So I really loved that you are taking back that trope and doing it different.
Thank you. Because I mean, your listeners maybe can't see, but there's a bunch of thread and sewing stuff. I really like sewing. And I just find the trope that you have a heroine who shows shows her feminism through a hatred of sewing, I find is a trope that has gotten kind of tired. And so I wanted to have a trope, or well, to sort of turn that on its head and have a character who is desperate to learn the traditions that have been lost to her and is really striving to recover those things and wants those back. So that was why I made embroidery such, even though I'm not very good at embroidery personally, I made it
I've tried. It's hard, but it's also like it is so much of a beauty. You're honoring that beauty that has been lost because all of us as females have been, almost trained by this trope in the media to not appreciate embroidery because it just signifies our oppression. But it's actually a really important sense of beauty that historically women have added to the world.
But it's interesting too, because if you see the things that a lot of embroiderers are doing now, they're embroidering quite political messages, right? Subversive. I was kind of inspired by that too, to see things that these women are making. So I wanted to work that in as well.
Yeah, you did. I always love to see a trope turned on its head and someone do something different from what we're used to seeing. But this especially really spoke to me and really made me excited about this story. The other thing that was really working is you've created characters in a world where there are high stakes. There's a lot of layers of history, culture, and conflict that all separately and spun together, it seems really insurmountable for your main characters to overcome. Not only is this conflict overarching and encompassing of all of a people group, but you also made it very personal. So it affected Era and her sister, Era. Okay, Era. We're gonna ask you pronunciation too, because you came up with such beautiful character names and I really don't want to butcher them. We will ask you pronunciation throughout. But yeah, Era and her sister, in an especially complicated and painful way, this is all affecting them. And that kind of weaving and layering that you did, even just in this first chapter of all the different levels of conflict, made your world feel realistic. And it just shows that you have a really solid grasp on world building and story structure. Because conflict is the engine that tells a story. It's what gets people to keep turning pages because there's something happening here and we need it resolved. So we said this kept us really entertained. More specifically, it was the way that you presented the conflict that kept us.
Yeah, that's good to know. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for the pleasure of reading this. This was so fun. Okay, real quick, I'll throw in, because I know that Charles said something really positive here at the end. He said it was a very strongly composed text with very believable characters. And we'll get more into some of the technical critiques to plus it up even more. In general, like that's what we're working with. This is already a really solid story. And any comment that we would add to it is only going to make it even stronger. So yeah, before we get into kind of the more the negative side, but really it's like the exciting part because we want to brainstorm together how to make it stronger. We don't just want to be like telling you our opinion, but I'll let Jared get into more of those disclaimers because I feel like I've been talking.
Yeah, so the normal disclaimers that we do say is that we always try to tell you these are just our opinions, our perspective on the story. It is by no means a reflection of your ability as a writer or anything of that nature. And as always, everything that we suggest is just that, a suggestion. The thing that we always recommend with anybody that works with us is everything we do is in service to the story, and it's your story. So in service of your story, we always want to make sure that we stay in line with what you're doing. We're not going to turn this into the next Game of Thrones if that's not what you don't want it to be. Yeah, just want to be clear about that. So we can dive in.
Yeah, and feel free, to Jared's point, like feel free to interrupt us whenever with any additional details that you have to add, because again, a lot of our suggestions are based on our subjective opinion. So if you have more information to add or you have some pushback to give us with a suggestion, please interrupt us. Let's make it a discussion. All right.
Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was on page 1. And it's basically piggybacking off of Jaylon. So I'm sorry, Jaylon, but I'm going to have to use your comment to make what I'm saying relevant. But she had mentioned in this sentence here where if I radiated a sense of purpose, nobody would bother to question what two laundresses were doing upstairs. And then Jaylon had said she would basically move this as our opening sentence. I agreed with that because because I think it's really important to start us off by forcing us to ask questions.
Okay.
However, one of the things that I also suggested was if we didn't need the pack of noble girls and all of that stuff, like if that wasn't absolutely necessary or needed in the story, I would actually start here on page 2, where we say, do we have to do this?
Okay.
Just let that be the opening thing. So the first thing we read is this, and now we're like, well, what are they doing? Where are they going? What's happening? And so this tells us everything that we need to know about these people. There's conflict immediately in the first sentence. There's this interesting saying that I read somewhere, I don't remember where I read it, but where they talk about wherever possible, tell the whole story of the book in the first sentence. And what it ultimately means is that you want maybe obviously you can't tell a whole story, but if you can give me an idea of what the story actually means, what the story's actually about, who the character is, whatever it is in that first sentence, that's going to lock me in on the story. So that's where I would start things. I would start things there. I'm sure we've all heard of the, enter as late as possible. Enter late, leave early is a common thing that we talk about in writing. And I think that doing it like that is fantastic. Starting in the middle of a conversation, it always works well, and it works well in books. I also think it's very, very cinematic. Another thing you'll learn about me is of all of the 3 editors, I am far more interested in how do I make the work more cinematic? How do I make it more like you're reading a movie when you read this than just reading a book? So that's the first thing that I would take a look at or consider. This next part here, back on page 1, pack of noble girls. I wanted to know, one, is this phrasing intentional? And if so, well, I'll let you answer first, and then I'll go on and end.
Well, I guess with that, I was just going with the cluster of girls who have their own sort of worldview, and they're going to enforce it on everybody else. And I also wanted to show, you have these 2 main characters, or just 2 characters who are laundresses, who are at the very bottom of the pecking order, and then there's these other visitors who, even though they're not from there, are acting like they own the place, right? So that was why I put them in. And like something I've always struggled with in my writing is I put in too much exposition. So like if you think that they don't need to be there, I'm certainly open to hearing that and possibly changing it to where you suggested opening it. I'm also worried about the word count just being insanely high.
Jaylon is really good about keeping track of the word count and making sure it's not. I am not. I will write a 500,000 word book if she lets me. So I understand.
We'll read it. I'll just say, like, let's trim it down and give to people in small pieces.
So the reason why I was asking if it was intentional or unintentional is because the term I like the term a pack used, especially if the idea that we're trying to give is not just that they're this cliquey group, but also it kind of gives, for me, the imagery that pops in my head is like wolves. It's like these vicious individuals who will tear us apart if given the chance. And I like that idea. So if that's what you were going for, I would keep it. I would also keep this section. I'm going to tell you what you can do with this exposition a little bit later in my thing, because there's a point of how we could use this. I'm not going to go into that now. So for now, we'll just put a pin in that. I like the pack of noble girls thing, and if it works, if you feel like that's what you were going for, I would keep it. If that's not what you were going for, I might consider changing that a little bit or altering it or even just cutting it all together. But the next thing, back to page 2, I was piggybacking off what Jaylon said again. So sorry, Jaylon, but Jaylon was talking about making sure that we didn't have the dialogue here, the doesn't it bother you that all these fancy, I'm not sure the pronunciation of that.
Sorry.
Okay. You said it better than me, so we'll just let that be the thing. Women turned up here in embroidered gowns. Anyway, methods that they stole from us and then forbade us to make for ourselves. Jaylon, when you were talking, you'll be able to explain this a little bit better as to what you were thinking. But what I was thinking was that, going back to that conversation I had earlier about how it hit me as an individual of a disenfranchised community, I want her to be more angry than this. This is they're disrespectful. They are disrespectful to her. I imagine that in seeing these people wearing the gowns and just basically living and bathing in their culture and then kind of turning their nose up at them is rage filling. It has to be.
Mhm.
And so even if she's not gonna, curse or be, vulgar and like attack them or anything like that, maybe she has to bridle that rage a little bit. So she's holding it back. But we as the reader understand that, oh, this is somebody who's really angry. And I would be angry too. The reader should be angry too. We want to like feel this from her. So that's what I was thinking in that. And then moving down to the next thing. This was another one where I thought you did a great job describing the moment.
Well, I do have a question for both of you about this, actually, because so there's the two languages. So there's her own language, Hotrean, which she's not been allowed to speak or learn how to read and write. And then there's the Jakransari language, which has two alphabets. So one is very simple, easy to learn. She can read that. She cannot read the more complex alphabet. So most of the books in the library are in the Jakransari language, so the language of the oppressor. Now, she still wants to learn how to read that just because she's hungry for knowledge and she's hungry for learning in general. She also wants to learn how to read her own language, but I'm not sure that the distinction between those two comes across, or if that's okay, because it's still really early on in the book and I have more time to make that distinction. But I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll say that was actually one of the easier things for me to kind of grasp and understand quickly. I mean, it's very similar to Asian languages like Korean, Japanese. So like I immediately was able to pick that up, and I think that you described it very well. So yeah, I'd say no worries there.
This is where we differ, only because for me, the way that I process information, sometimes it's very, very challenging for me to like visualize things or understand an abstract thought like that. So for me, it wasn't as clear. I was just thinking there was knowledge that she wanted and she wanted it, and that was good enough for me. It didn't matter to me either way. But I didn't put together that there were two separate languages. Now, this is one of those things where you're going to have different types of readers. And this is what we talk about all the time for other writers, of like why it's important to get the perspective of people like Jaylon, people like Charles, people like me, because the three of us are very different readers and we take things very differently. So your audience will be different types of people. And so the folks that are like me, who may not have put that together, but it doesn't really matter, would say if you really want to find a way to more differentiate it, it won't hurt my feelings if you choose to spell it out for me a little bit more than you did. But you don't need to, as long as it doesn't hinder me from understanding the story going forward.
Okay.
So that's how I felt about it. And now going back to my original comment, this comment that I was making was in relation to the perfect that I said later on. So that whole, like, if I was patient, I would have seen that you had really done it. But I really felt like here, it was like she saw the only volumes that remained toppled on their sides where their fellows had once stood. And I was thinking, oh, this is a really sad moment. To me, this is symbolic of how culture can be changed, how culture can be replaced and then taken away and all that kind of. And I was like, I want to feel that. So going back to that comment I made earlier, give me more of that. Give me more of that. And it doesn't have to be something that we draw out for paragraph upon paragraph, but a few sentences of just how does she feel about that? Okay. How does Naya, or is it Naya? Neandra. So Neandra. How does Neandra feel about it in this moment? And just kind of getting that. I mean, obviously, it being from Era's perspective, she doesn't know what's going on in the other girl's head, but still, you can show us in her body language and those kinds of things. Show us what Neandra's body language is saying, what she's feeling, so that way we have an understanding that this is a really powerful moment for both of them here. So that would be my suggestion there. There's my perfect. The next one on page 4. So one of the things I was just talking about here was the filler, and it was just one of those things that was just ruining the if we could remove that out, and it'd be.
I try so hard to get rid of those, and they always every time.
I do it all the time. In fact, it's more of a more recent thing that I've noticed it in editing my novel, that I'm like, I use this a lot more than I realize. And I was like, so now whenever I'm doing client work and so that, I'm like, oh, I get it, that they're doing the thing that I do. So no.
It's one of the superpowers of having an editor, and having an editor also that's a writer themselves, because we totally understand, we totally get it, and we know exactly what to watch out for because we've made all the mistakes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, the next one is on page 5. Okay, so we're talking about Lady, is it all right. So we're talking about her. And my question here was, is there a way for us to learn more about her without you telling us? So we have all of this exposition about who she is, that she's smarter than, she's not as dumb, which is a very interesting way of putting it, because you're not saying necessarily that she's smart, but you are saying that she's not
Loved it.
as the rest of them. And the fact that it says a lot about what Era feels about her, and the way she describes her. So I liked that. But she is telling us a lot about her. Is there dialogue that she could use that would help us see, oh, well, she, and then we can have Era react to that dialogue. So she can say something that's kind of stupid, but not as stupid as someone else.
Yeah.
And then Era's kind of like, okay, yeah, you're dumb, but like, okay, cool. But like, show us more of why she's this way. Don't tell me all the things about her. Show me all the things about her. So further down on page 5, here is where I had another question. I thought I was missing something. But did we mention earlier in the story somewhere that Eric could speak to ghosts?
Well, she can't.
Oh.
Just there's I guess I need to clarify that, because there is a ghost that haunts the manor. And the ghost will, whenever anybody tries to hurt her, the ghost will freak out and stop them, which there's a reason for that, which I don't, it's a spoiler, so I can't say, but she's never actually talked to him. So, but Alice knows that if she tries to pull anything, there will be a consequence. So, but I guess I need to make that more clear, because there's a lot of resentment from the 3 siblings who run the manor that the ghost protects Era. Is their father, it's their father's ghost. And so why is he sticking his neck to her? Yeah, but I think part of my struggle is that this is the first fantasy novel I've written, and also like there are a lot of moving parts. I think my storyline is maybe too complicated, and I'm like, how do I fit everything in without overloading people? Or I'm still figuring that out in the draft.
World building is a double-edged sword, because you want it to be complicated and layered. That's how you know that you have a really good fantasy. But on the other hand, it's super easy to info dump. So it's walking that fine line. And again, that's what editors and beta readers are for. A lot of our comments, a lot of Charles's comments in particular, he has a great way of being able to pick out where something sounds like info dumping and tweaking it just a little bit, so that now it sounds like we're immersed in the story and we're just taking in the information as we're living it. It's not a narrator dumping information on us like we're reading a textbook. We will get into that more later, but don't be discouraged by the extra work that comes with having to backpedal from info dumping, because you do have a really great storyline, and those different layers are what makes it so great.
Yeah, it's a learning process.
For sure. Absolutely. And it's a never-ending learning process. Believe me, I still feel like I'm always learning something new, and Jaylon or Charles will make an edit on something I wrote, and then I will be like, I can't believe that I let that get out into the world and let her see that, or let them see that. So believe me, I understand completely. The reason why I bring up the ghost thing is because not only so it's clear now she doesn't speak to ghosts, but also I was also wondering, had I missed a mention of the ghost doing anything before that? This is the first time the ghost has done anything, or they've mentioned it. Yeah. Okay. There's a thing that I mentioned later on too that's also similar. But what you want to do is we want to plant seeds of this a little bit earlier, because this was a little jarring for me, because when we started talking about a ghost, I was like, is she being sarcastic? Is Lady Alice dumb, like actually dumb? And so Era's trying to relate to a 14-year-old girl, so she's doing this like ghost thing with her to make it make more sense, or is there like a real ghost? I just didn't know. And that really took me out of it. And I also didn't know that this was, because we've been talking about embroidery and the text and the library, and it seems like a very grounded fantasy world. And then all of a sudden now we're talking about ghosts. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I didn't know that was even a possibility in this world. So if we can find a way to put that in earlier, so that way we just know, we have a hint of like what the tone is, what kind of world we're living in. So that was what I was talking about in that paragraph. Then before we leave page 5, there's one more where we're talking. This is another one of those things of rather than telling, which we were talking about, I said with very real conviction. And so what does very real conviction sound like? What does it look like? As I always say, show me, don't tell me. So what does it sound like when she's did she, squeeze her voice out? Did she raise her voice a couple of octaves? Or what's it like in her body? Does she stand a little bit taller? These are things that I think one of those, only one, we don't need them all, but like only one of those would be better, a much better way of saying this is how she used conviction to express her, or this is what real conviction looks like.
Okay.
Let's see. Moving on to page 6. Okay. So here's where I was agreeing with Charles, where I was thinking that whenever we have action of any kind, even if it's a little small bit of action, and this is something I've noticed very recently in my own work, whenever we have action, sometimes we like to throw in a little bit of exposition to try to break up the action and make it so that it doesn't feel like this technical thing, because unlike a movie where like when there's a fight or when something happens, you can see it. It's in a book, when I tell you that so and so are throwing blows with one another or whatever, it's very hard to keep track of all of that in your head. So sometimes we will throw in things like exposition so that we can learn a little bit about the character while also doing that stuff. The problem with that is sometimes that slows down the action itself.
Yes.
So when we have the whole my ankle twitch beneath its bond ring, as if remembering how the iron band had burned and tightened the last time I'd been forced outside the limits of the warding enchantment placed on me. It's very interesting information about her. But in this moment of what's happening, where Neandra is basically attacking her a little bit here, it's like, then that should be the focal point. Her history and what happened to her, although all valuable information, all very interesting, it's not particularly necessary right here because it's taking us out of what's happening in the moment.
Yeah, I see.
So I would find another place to put that if you really want to share that. Or there's some ways we can tweak it in the prose to make it more relevant. Charles would be way better at it than I would. Maybe even Jaylon might have a better idea.
I was going to say, even just moving it right up here as a reaction immediately to what says, because a lot of this is like, this was actually, I highlighted it in green because it was one of the things that I saw you do really well. I loved this sentence. And this is one of the, like Jared was saying, one of the best ways to disguise info dumping is, to write history into a reaction of what's happening presently. So this sentence in particular was really good about doing that. And so it's just tightening up everything around it to make this sentence be the reaction that is happening in the fast action that's happening, if that makes sense.
This mention of the bond ring it's not so important for this chapter, but it's really key for following. Basically, all of the serfs at this manor, they all have to wear this iron ring on their ankles, and it prevents them from going too far beyond the bounds of the manor. Ira's is actually much stricter than anybody else's. Like, she can't leave the manor, period. She has a much more restrained places where she can go than the others do. So I wanted to plant that in this chapter, even though it doesn't really become important until the next one. But again, I think I did it awkwardly. So
the seed that was planted there was still good.
I have an idea about this. So can you describe for me the bond ring just so that I can visualize it? Because I might have an idea.
So it's just an iron ring that goes around your ankle. So everybody has a boundary. If you pass the boundary, it starts to constrict and it starts to burn into your skin, basically. So the further you go from the boundary, the worse it will get until it can actually kill you. So, or even if you're not that far outside of it, but you're outside of it for a certain length of time, it will kill you. So, and again, most of the other serfs, they can wander quite a bit further than she can, but she can't leave the house, basically.
How close is the library to her?
Well, it's inside,
boundary?
so she can move freely within the house. That's fine.
Okay.
She's not really restrained in that way, but she just can't go outside the walls.
How does it feel when she's walking? Is this something that would brush against her ankle and that kind of thing?
Yeah, she's had it for years. So, I guess she would feel it, but it's been there so long too. I guess I could write in her noticing it as she's walking or something.
I'm thinking that in that the opening part of the chapter where she's walking, we talk about the gown of rich burgundy silk draped over her arm. I feel like even if we started with the whole, do we have to do this thing?
Mm-hmm.
in her response, we can make a comment. She can remark on how the ring feels around her ankle, and that way, even though it becomes more important what that ring is and what that all means later, we've mentioned it earlier. We now know that, so we'll ask that question. Well, what's the ring around her ankle for? Then we'll, it's planted, not a big deal, and now it's in a thing that it doesn't. There's no action happening other than the walk and talk that seems to be happening right now. So that's something you can drop in a little bit of exposition without it feeling like it's removing us from the actual story. That might be a thought of a way to do it. So the next note that I had was this line here where you say it was a cheap shot, but it worked. This was a situation where I felt that it was slowing the pacing down. I feel like as a reader, I was able to put 2 and 2 together that this was a cheap shot. So I feel like we didn't need to say it, as well as the fact that I felt that lady's response also told me that it was a cheap shot. And the fact that she responded the way she did with the sulking also told me that it worked. So I felt like that sentence itself, we didn't really need it. It was just sort of, it made it all redundant. So I would just cut that if you could. This right here on page 7, I also mentioned consider cutting this, the shelf swinging open smoothly, because we already know the books are gone. We already talked about it a little bit more. So we don't need to, you can just say the shelf swung open smoothly, and call it a day. Okay. Page.
Yeah. Okay.
9. Hold on 1 second. I also feel like I might have missed one of my.
If
other
you
comments.
did this, we will be sending this entire document to you, so you'll get whatever comments we aren't self-explanatory that will go into here, but you'll get all the ones that are self-explanatory later.
Right. Okay. So at the end of page 9, when she talks about none of us dare to breathe. This is as I say in my comment, this is a nitpicky thing, but it's one of those things that this is from the perspective of Era. So how does she know that nobody else is breathing? I mean, obviously there is the, like, she could hear that nobody else is breathing. That's fine. But I don't know. Again, this is a completely nitpicky thing. It's just something that I was like, when reading it, it immediately made me stop and say, well, how does she know? But that's just me. There are plenty of readers that will be like, no, that's totally cool. It's fine. It doesn't bother me at all. So don't allow my OCD about silly things like that to dictate. I just wanted to point it out that was what that comment was about. I cannot find the other line, but I remember what the comment was. There's a part in here somewhere where someone says that Era is magicless. And so in that, this goes back to the conversation about the ghost. Again, the reading that I had done, it felt like this was a very grounded fantasy world. It wasn't, I didn't know there was magic in it up until that point. Okay. So when it said that she was magicless, my thinking was, well, isn't everybody magicless? Who has magic? Where is there magic conversations? So it's one of those things of just kind of layering that in earlier, so that we just have, it doesn't, and like I said, it doesn't have to be an overt, massive, multi-paragraph thing. It could just be a simple sentence that just sort of signifies that somebody does have magic. And somebody who doesn't. Maybe there is an empire person that is known for their ability to wield magic, and it's a part of the conversation. Something that just lets us know that, there are people who have magic abilities in this world.
A lot of it is class based. So Era doesn't have any magical ability. Most people have some inherent ability, but then to become really good at it, you need to be very strongly educated. And so the serfs don't have access to that. So there may be serfs that she works with that actually are quite talented, but they've never had any chance to develop it. And so that does come up later. But I wasn't sure how explicit I wanted to be about that in this chapter, other than to make it clear that she regrets that she has none, bothers her. So I don't know if I need to change how that's portrayed here, or
I like that. I like the idea of her being sort of regretting that she doesn't have it. And then the idea of somebody else that she works with could be the greatest, or could be really great at this, and they can't be. And so there's a little bit of envy of them. And that statement of envy, it's character revealing. It tells us a little bit more about Era, but it also tells us a little bit more about the world at the same time.
It could even be, we're talking about this opening of her walking down the hallway. And if you're just trying to plant seeds here that you can then expound on later in these conversations to establish that this is a world where magic exists, you can even talk about, there's magical lighting structures down the hall, or say something like, it could come up in Era's comment about the noblewomen who are allowed to wear this embroidery. It could also come up in that comment, they're allowed to, develop their magic, and the rest of us are so that might be another way that you can just sneak it in there with what's already there.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, so I have two more comments. So the second to last one is, it's not a specific thing, it's more of just a note that I wanted to make so that I didn't forget. I put you said the story was based on your form. So the question I had is I wanted to know if Era is the woman who's going to be married.
Okay, so I like the arranged marriage trope, but I get that a lot of people don't like it. So I wanted to try to find a way to flip it. Basically, the character Danae, who you see in this chapter, that's Alice's older sister. The male main character, Torin, is engaged to marry Lady Danae, so like one of the daughters of the household. But he inherited that contract from his brother. It was originally his brother who was supposed to marry her, but he died. He got killed in a war. So Torin now has to take this contract over. He doesn't want to marry her. He doesn't like her. But it's this sort of forced arranged marriage. So he's going to show up, and then something happens where the family offends him, and in order to save face, because it's a very honor-based society, he strikes back saying, I'll release her from the contract, but then I get to pick someone else from your household to marry. And he picks Era as partially to save her because she's been horribly injured by them, but partially to slap them back in the face, basically to say like, well, your daughter's not good enough for me, but I'm choosing your servant. She's better. So I wanted to play with that whole arranged marriage thing a little bit, and also give grounds for Era to mistrust him initially at first, because as far as she's concerned, he's done this for his own interest. He hasn't done it out of any desire to save her or anything, even though that's not true. So that's where I'm going with that.
There's a couple things that I have been thinking about that.
Okay.
I think that, and again, I restate the disclaimer that this is purely just my suggestions here, but one of the things that I think is most important about a first chapter, especially for, you have ADHD as well, so you understand the need to, probably better than a lot of others, the need to grab people by the throat immediately. My attention needs to be grabbed immediately for me to lock in for a fantasy book of all stories, because fantasy stories are usually like 400 pages, 500 pages, sometimes way longer than that because their authors are psychotic. But whatever it may be, for me to lock in for 400 pages or more, your first chapter has to make me want to do that. I felt that this first chapter was very entertaining. It was very great. But to me, it kind of felt like an episode of a really cozy cartoon of stuff that was happening. And I didn't feel there was any real connection to the story that you said the story was ultimately about. So what I was thinking is, one, if we wanted to, this goes back to that beginning part about like keeping the pack of girls or whatever. If you wanted to keep that or some variation of it, I think one, there's no mention of a resistance really that I saw. There was no mention of anything like that, so I didn't know that they existed. You said the girls were gossiper, an interesting thing would be having them gossip about the resistance. The resistance is probably doing things in a world where resistance are oftentimes seen as terrorists. They would have to be doing some sort of terrorist acts, things they were doing. So maybe that's what the girls are gossiping about. So then it doesn't become just like girls, doing girl gossip things, but no, they're talking about real political things and real, things that are going on. So that one tells me there's more beneath the surface that's here. And that way, even if it's not a huge conversation, if it's just like, did you hear about what they did in the square or whatever? Now I'm thinking, okay, cool. So when Eric joins this resistance, I have that callback to the first chapter of when that happened, and I know. The other thing, and now that this I didn't know until you said this, about what the male main character is going to do, what you might consider doing, and this would require you to basically redo this whole chapter, but what you might consider doing, since we're talking about jumping in as late as possible, is opening the story with our male main character being offended, but not from his perspective, from Era's perspective. So she's there, she's watching all this stuff happening, she's watching whatever, she's hearing these remarks, and she's I don't know if you've ever seen that gif of the cat from Shrek where he's like, ooh, like, and so like she's doing that because now they've offended him, and she's like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And then he's like, well, fine, I'll choose her. And then your first chapter ends with her being like, me. Now we're like, wait a minute, like, oh, what's going on? And now there's all this, there's this drama, there's this conflict, and there's real stuff going. And now it's all connected to what the story is actually about right from the beginning. Because I feel like most readers, yes, readers are far more patient than, let's say, TV watchers who will turn off a show at within a few minutes. Readers will give you a couple of chapters before they put the book down, but I will not. So I will usually give you the first chapter, and if the first chapter doesn't do it for me, I'm out of here. So I think that based on just because what you just said about the male main character was infinitely more entertaining than everything that's happened in this chapter. Because now I'm like, oh, this is interesting. He's been offended. He's laying down ultimatums. There's court drama that seems to be happening here, and then to have that all through the eyes of Era would be really, really interesting, because you get these ideas about this is where you can have that and not necessarily info dumping, but this is where you can have that exposition of like explaining what certain things mean and her opinion of the three siblings and how they're all idiots and all, because maybe they're all present and maybe there's all kinds of stuff going on there. So I think that might be a cool way to do it. Again, totally up to you, but I think it's a fantastic way to grab us from the beginning and still connect it to what the story's about. Because if I can tell what your story is going to be about, maybe not predict what's going to happen, but if I can get a better idea what your story is about in the first chapter, I have a better chance of keeping me locked in for the whole thing. So that was my second to last comment, but I guess that second to last comment is my last comment, because it goes to the same thing of like, as much as I was entertained by the writing, I felt that it didn't connect as well to the premise that you shared with us. And I think that you might want to basically see previous comment for
Okay.
And that's all that
Thank
I
you.
had to say.
Great.
That was a lot.
Really helpful. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
You're very gracious at taking feedback, because we know how it feels like when you've poured so much of yourself into a story and then it's time for editing and people start ripping it apart. It feels really personal. It feels like they're attacking like your heart that you poured out onto the page. So we totally understand that. And the fact that you're willing to take these critiques in the interest of making the story stronger and helping it to connect with more people who need to hear these words is really awesome. It's commendable.
Thank you.
I'll try and be quick because Jared did cover a lot of stuff. I had two overarching things. No, you're good. I appreciate that I have to talk less now. But yeah, there's two overarching things, and then all of the little comments kind of tie into that, so it's just examples of these overarching things. So the first thing being contrast. So stories thrive off of contrast. It's one of the ways that we illustrate our kind of intangible points in a very tangible way that sticks in reader brains. So when you take two opposing things and contrast them and like kind of paint that contrast with bright colors, now it sticks in your readers' minds more, so then they connect what you're contrasting more strongly with the symbolism of your themes that come out later. So I saw a lot of different really interesting contrasting details in your story, but I thought that if you set them against each other more clearly, then they'll stick out better. So for example, the characters of Era and Neandra having two separate responses to being in bondage. Neandra is, especially in that opening scene where, Era was saying how she didn't want to take Neandra with her because she had so much nervous energy. Yeah. So her response to being put in bondage is she shrinks to try and avoid inciting more wrath. But Era's response is she rages to set right the wrongs. So contrasting those responses more might make it stand out as like, this is a core theme that we're talking about. We're talking about how to respond to cultural appropriation and this disrespect and unfairness in the world that, it doesn't just exist in fantasy realms. It exists in the real world, and we need to know how to deal with it. These two different responses are very understandable, but setting each of those characters up to have those responses. One of the things that we talk about in the One Brilliant Arc method when we're outlining is each of your characters represents a different point on your thematic scale. So whatever your thematic statement is of your story, each character is going to be of different, varying points of either agreeing completely or disagreeing completely. And then there's going to be some people right in the middle too. So every character and their arc now becomes their own mini illustration of your overarching theme that connects to the whole storyline, if that makes sense. I know those are like big concept pictures that I'm drawing with very little context, but using each of these characters to symbolically represent an individual conversation that you want to have with the reader. So talking about, how to set these two contrasting responses against each other. So here, when we're talking about, Neandra is letting out a silent roar and, making a show of pretending to strangle Era because Era's like gotten them into this, troublesome situation. Era says, beneath her obvious anger, I saw her fear, which was running through me too. But I was thinking like Neandra's character is she has more obvious fear instead of anger. And so maybe the anger is less obvious. It's buried underneath her fear. And, I wanted to make sure we didn't switch the characterization here. Because there can be different layers to her characterization. Like she can still have anger, but it's just the fear has to be the obvious response. And then the anger is buried beneath, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm reading her very much as a character who she goes along to get along, basically. And I also wrote her as an Enneagram 9, so someone who's very like conflict averse. When an Enneagram 9 gets tripped, whoa, when it does happen, it's like, wow. I wanted to show her in one of those moments here. She's like, I'll kill you.
I totally got that. It was one of those little things that was like, okay, but make the fear obvious, make the anger be like the thing that's coming out that Era didn't expect. So there's one example of a great piece of contrast that you have. Now just amplify it, make it louder. Another contrast that I noticed was, correct me on the pronunciation, the Revans?
Revans.
Yeah. Okay. The Revans want to lord themselves over others, but they actually have nothing of substance because they're bankrupt and unrecognized, and they need to purchase their respect, but they're unrespectable people. So those kinds of contrasts were jumping out at me as like, that's very interesting. Now amplify it, make it louder, make it more obvious that these are the contrasts. We kind of talked about this where they're overhearing this conversation between the two older siblings while hiding in the bookshelf. And we get the idea that I didn't get his first name. He was just referred to as Revan, even though that's the family name, but the eldest son. He, being, Era's response of revulsion rose within me as I remembered his grip on my arms, the odious slipperiness of his mouth as he forced it down over mine. First of all, this was a super great detail because this is one of the examples of you took this grand overarching conflict that you have in this world and you made it personal to this one character. And now we're really invested. Now we really want to see these wrongs righted. So this was really great. But it also very clearly showed that, Rayvon was not a person worthy of respect. He did disrespectful things. So now set this against, he's trying to save face. He's trying to buy honor and make it obvious to your readers, like, oh, that's not going to work. Like now we have conflict. Now we have that tension of he's trying to buy honor as a dishonorable person. So that's another way that you can really hook your readers and keep them turning pages because they have to see like, this isn't going to work. How is he going to make this work? And lastly, another example of contrast was, and I know that you pronounced it before, Danae's. So Danae's character, first of all, I really liked her character in particular, because I feel like we understood a lot of different perspectives through her one character, but I kind of saw in her character, let me find the specific example here. A flush appeared on Lady Diana's cheeks. She drew herself up taller as if to fire back. But when he moved to leave the library, she held the door for him. You kind of talk about like she always makes a show about standing up to him, but then she ultimately goes along. And that's a contrast within her character that is really interesting. I want to know more, but make it more of an obvious contrast so that we know like this isn't a confliction of her character. This isn't like her being two-faced. This is one character and these contrasting responses make sense. So that's another thing to dive into. The note here is I just want to see more of this explored because then like these characters are super interesting, dichotomies that we can have two differing truths within the same person. That's very realistic. I mean, that's the way we are as humans. But you just have to be careful when you're talking about a character where people are used to reading archetypes and stories. You have to make it clear that this isn't a conflict of who this character is by them having these contrasting responses. This makes sense. And then lastly, and you kind of dug into this at the end, but the contrast between Era notices Lady Alacy and her sister Neandra look so much the same right here. It's only the circumstance of life that has them living two completely different lives. I really love that contrast because that's such a great way to illustrate in a way that gets under readers' skin, like what Jared was talking about. This is how unjust this is. This is how angering this is, because you can see how unfair that some people are treated like humans and some people aren't. So this is one of those contrasts that I think that it'll really support your theme. So definitely, like, this was great. Keep this at all cost. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, and then lastly, the last big overarching thing was Neandra's character in particular, because again, this is like the thematic scale. And I mean, I kind of already mentioned a lot of this, but I wanted to see her utilized more to show the range of different reactions to this central conflict. I don't want her to be a background character because her character was already used in so many of these contrasting ways to show why your story is important to read, like what's the deeper thing you're saying beneath this story. So that's kind of more what I was talking about there. So I'll wrap it up with that. But I will go back to one thing Charles said. This is more of like, you know, a little nitpicky trick to make it less like character dumping or not character dumping, info dumping, and more like a sneaky way of just immersing your readers in the information.
Right.
As if they're in your main character's point of view. So making the language, as we're overhearing conversations, make a language very natural so that it brings more to the reader. So you're, you know, speaking very proper when you refer to characters by their full title, lord or lady or clan or whatever. So something as little as taking away some of those titles and just leaving it up to the reader will make us feel like the characters' lines are less info dumping and more immersion. So that's, again, it's like a really little trick, and sometimes little tricks make all the difference, but that's one way to avoid the info dumping when you're trying to, like, you did great world building and now you're just trying to get people to intake that world building without overwhelming them. Kind of what Charles mentioned in his very last comment here. You know, it's a really strong text, but just make sure that you guide your reader through your world building and polish some of the technical details, because that's what's going to lead them through as if they're falling into this world and like it's, you know, a beautiful, consuming, engaging dream, as opposed to this is a textbook full of information that I have to commit to memory in order to appreciate the story. So yeah, that wraps it up. Before we jump into our last topic, before we close out, do you have any questions about all of this that we just threw at you?
Like, do I have too many? I mean, I know I have a lot of characters, and I know there's a lot of specialized vocabulary about their ranks and things like that. Do I have too many? Like, is it more just a question of introducing their names maybe without so many of the titles and things like that?
Okay, I'll answer and then I'll let Jared answer, because I think this is going to be another thing where, like, it's going to depend on your reader. It's going to depend on if they're used to the fantasy genre and having all of this, you know, that they have to digest. Or whether they're used to reading contemporary fiction. I will say that it doesn't feel like there's too many characters, because I think that, again, the fact that you have such a layered world shows the depth of it. It shows the skill that you have in world building. Realistic worlds have a lot of characters, so it makes it believable in that way. I think, like you said, it's just going to be a matter of making sure that you're not introducing too many at one time, so that readers can keep them separate in their brains easier.
Okay.
For me, and for the neurodivergent reader or folks who just have really short attention spans, I would say it is a lot of characters. I would say, especially for a first chapter, because the only thing that I really need from my first chapter is I need to know who the main players are. Who's my main character? If there's an antagonistic force that I can introduce in the first chapter, who's that going to be? Is there an idea or at least a snippet of what the central conflict's going to be? Give me those things in the first chapter, and that's all. Lord this person and Lady that person are great layers and great stuff like that, but I think you can introduce them slower. Let them trickle in a little bit here and there. But if they are not necessary to what we're trying to do in that first chapter, I wouldn't. Another thing that I've seen in fantasy novels that I've really liked is a kind of guide of who people are in the beginning. Yeah, so if you do need to introduce all of these characters in the first chapter, give me a guide so that way I can flip back through and say, okay, this is that person is, this is that person is. Because me personally, not only is my attention span really short, but also I have a terrible memory. So I am not going to remember any of these people. I'll see them again later in chapter 5 and be like, I don't know who this is or why they're relevant, knowing that they were in the first chapter. So now I have to go back and see who is this and what was their relationship. So yeah, I think for your first chapter, I like to think of the first chapter almost like here's another cinematic reference. Your first chapter is almost like your movie trailer in a way. It's going to give me just enough for me to get an idea of what I should expect, the tone, the world, characters, and all of that. So that's my stance on it.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your
No
detailed
problem.
feedback.
We appreciate you trusting us with your story. Lastly, before we wrap up, because we talked a lot about like Jared said, if you don't have anything to say in your story, then it's not really an interesting story. We talk a lot about stories that are worth telling here, and stories that are worth telling have something beneath the story that is the bigger truth that it's trying to share. And that's theme. That's a story's theme. So we usually like to take a short minute at the end of these just to recap about what we're getting as readers from the theme in your story. So we'll share our thoughts of like what we got, and then you can share what you wrote with the theme in mind, if you had a theme in mind, because that's really that's what will get readers to read your book, is if they know that they need to, because there's something in it that is valuable to their lives. So Jared, I will let you go first when it comes to talking about what's the theme that we found in this story.
Okay, so normally I have lots of things to say about theme because it's ironically enough, it's one of my favorite things about story, which I say ironic because I used to struggle with understanding what theme was and why it needed to be included or what anything was. But now that I understand it, now I love it. But in this particular case, I don't have a lot to say about the theme because, as I mentioned in my feedback, I felt that this chapter worked almost like a short story. It felt very independent of what the rest of the story is going to be about, and because of that, it was really hard for me to pin down what the whole piece was about. This is not to say that a short story can't have a theme. But I think that in this particular case, for me, the main things that stood out to me were the idea of cultural erasure and the idea of how we stand against or for that, how individuals who benefit from systems that erase other cultures like to sort of lounge around in that entitlement, in that corruption and all those things, and how those that are impacted by it are oftentimes thrown to the wayside and their trauma is ignored. And those are some of the things that I pulled from this first chapter. Now, if that is going to translate into the rest of the book, fantastic.
Very similarly, I was pulling from, and this made me excited because, again, if this really is the theme that we're going with, I'm so in. But when we had that conversation between Era and Neandra, with Era was remembering the mother that raised her, and we were mentioning the different reactions to when you're systemically oppressed and your culture is stolen from you, then how do you deal with that? So the themes that I pulled out were, is your ancestry a blessing or a curse when you've been systemically oppressed? And I pulled that from that conversation that you showed between, Neandra tried to hide her ancestry, kind of like her mother did, to avoid inciting more wrath. And so I kind of saw that conversation open up, and I was like, I love that theme is right in your first chapter in some of these character conversations and the contrast that you're drawing, because as a reader, I'm like, I'm in. I want to see the rest of this conversation. This is a conversation that's relevant to me. Another kind of spin on that would be, how do you reclaim sacred culture and dignity that's been stolen from you? So those were conversations that I saw opened up in this first chapter, and now you can let us know if this is a conversation that you'll be finishing throughout the rest of the story, or if you had a different conversation that you're getting into.
So the male main character, his father belongs to the Jackransari dominant culture, but his mother belongs to the Hotrean oppressed culture. And his response to this has been to try to find a way to make the system fair when it fundamentally cannot be. And the big conflict of his marriage with Aira is that she keeps telling him this cannot be fair. And because he works directly under the emperor and he's very invested in also proving that he is good enough for that system when he's been told his whole life that he's not because he has a mixed ethnicity. Right. So he's very invested in this. And she keeps saying, no, this cannot work. It fundamentally cannot work. And so that's the conflict of their marriage. And the decision he eventually makes about what to do about that drives the story. So I think it does tie in to this as a whole. So I guess that I'm setting that up there. But I think I need to take a look at that first chapter and make sure that it's more coherent, as Jared, as you said, just to make sure that that overarching storyline is more obvious in the first part. Yeah.
I'm very interested signing up in the story. As you gave us a little bit more details, I'm more interested in it now than I even was before. I'm currently reading a book called The Day Remains, The Remains of the Day, I should say. And I really like the idea of characters, specifically your mailman character, coming to grips with the reality of this thing that you hold dear not being what you think that it is, and kind of being forced to accept that. Stevens in that book has to reconcile that as well. And I like the idea of characters having to reconcile that, like the thing that they hold dear. In my novel, that's another thing where you have a character that their whole life they believed in this one thing, and then you start to realize that this thing you believe in is not exactly what you think it is. So I love that in general, and I think you should definitely do more of that. That sounds really, really exciting.
For sure.
Thank you so much. This has been really helpful and fun. I've enjoyed it a lot.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, that is exactly why we're here. We want to be truly helpful to the storytellers who are telling stories that matter and stories that can change the world. And you definitely have one on your hands here. This is a story that it tells such timely and poignant and deep truths that I think a lot of people in our culture, now we need stories to guide us through, as Jared said, like, people in our culture who are coming to terms with the system cannot be fixed. It cannot be made fair. As people come to that realization in real life, we need fantasy stories to show us how to deal with that. Because otherwise, like, there's no other instruction manuals. I think fantasy has a really special way, fiction in general has a really special way of being able to tell truths that are too heavy for just regular prose. So the storytellers like you who are telling these kinds of important stories are the ones who are going to change our world for the better and shape a future generation where we have more people equipped to deal with some of these bigger things in real life. In general, I would say, if we're wrapping up with final thoughts, my final thoughts would be, please get this story told, get it out into the world. Don't give up, because this is something so important that I can definitely see is needed in this world. There's readers who need this. And I hope that anyone listening to this podcast episode will also be interested in reading this story and go, hopefully, when you get it published, go pick up a copy.
Thank you. Well, conversations like this are very motivating, so thank you very much.
Well, we won't keep you any longer. We'll let you get back to writing. For anyone listening, if you've got a story that's tangled, stuck, or screaming to be better, please send it in. We'll treat it with care. We'll tell you the truth about it, but we will help you move one step closer to the version of the story that's worth telling. And no strings attached. This is completely free. We just really want to help writers who are telling important stories that the world needs. So check the show notes for a link to submit your stories. And Ellen, do you want to tell our listeners where they can find you and hear when this book is published?
So you can find me at lmsanders.com. I have a newsletter there that you can sign up for a free novella that's also set in the same world. And you can get updates about when this book will be coming out. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time. We will see you all next week.
See you later.
Thanks.
Awesome. Bye.